The Foreign Office was venerated in my family. My grandfather worked for the Foreign Office at Bletchley Park, breaking Nazi codes during the Second World War. Both my parents and my sister had tried to get into the Foreign Office and failed. And I was thought of very much as the stupid one of my family. My twin brother was put in the year ahead of me at school. And so there was a lot of doubt that I could ever do something like join the Foreign Office. And indeed, when I was about 12, I announced to my family that I wanted to be a diplomat. And my father turned to me and said, "You have to be very clever to be a diplomat, Carne." And thus was my ambition sealed. So, joining the Foreign Office, which is very difficult. There are very few people get in from the many thousands who apply, was a big way of saying to my family, that showed you. So I can't, admit to being driven by primitive emotion as well as highfalutin ambition. You speak for the state. So when you speak to a foreigner, you say, we believe X, Y, Z. And when you say we, you don't mean your family, your friends, or yourself. You mean the UK, you mean your state. So sometimes that means you negotiate on behalf of your state, which I did a lot of when I was posted to the UN in New York. Sometimes you just represent the state and say, Britain thinks this about this problem, or we want to promote trade in this country. I mean, to make it easier, you have very clear instructions. I mean, instructions go out from London, signed by the Foreign Secretary, telling you what to say, and indeed to a degree what to think about all kinds of things, from trade to the environment to terrorism to the Israel-Palestine issue. So you kind of have a script, and that script becomes, you very much imbibe that script, so it becomes part of you. But if you do go off script, that's trouble. I mean, minor instances can be forgiven, but even those might harm your career. And the people who do best are the people who seamlessly weave themselves into the identity of the state and think about what we need, meaning we Britain need. They start to think like the state, and indeed that's what happened to me to a degree. When you're overseas, your boss is your ambassador, the head of your embassy, but even he or she is ultimately subordinate to London, ultimately subordinate to the Foreign Secretary, who's obviously politically elected, and they decide what policy should be, but they are, of course, are subordinate themselves, ultimately to the Prime Minister and indeed to the monarch. So one of my most treasured possessions is a certificate that the Queen signed, appointing me her trusty and most beloved servant. So ultimately, you serve the sovereign, you're serving the state, not even the government. The government interprets what the state wants. I mean, it's a very interesting job. I mean, you're dealing with the stuff of international relations. You're one of the elite few who know what goes on between governments. You have extraordinary access to intelligence, both intercepts of other people's communications, or what's called HUMINT, stuff from MI6 about, from spies essentially. So you think that you get this extraordinarily privileged access to information. So you think you're kind of at the heart of what knowledge is. And that's very exciting when you're young. It's exciting when you're old. And there's a kind of deep status to it. You wear a nice suit. I got leather-soled shoes, which I soon realized are very foolish things to buy because they wear out so quickly. But, I was deeply into the whole status of it. I loved mentioning that I was in the diplomatic service. At parties, my parents were very proud of me. And it's interesting, so I enjoyed it. When I was at the UN in New York, there were only two places in the world where the Brits talked to the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein, and New York was one of them. And so I was designated the person who talked to Iraqi diplomats. And I would go and have coffee with them in the delegates' lounge, as it's called, in the UN building. And we would sit and talk. It wasn't, discussing our, what cooking we liked and our hobbies. It was work. So I would talk to them about how Iraq should comply with the UN Security Council resolutions. And the Iraqis would say that they had. And, the Iraqi counterpart I dealt with, even though he was a servant of the Saddam regime, was a perfectly straightforward, decent guy, even though he worked for a horrible, tyrannical dictatorship. Outside the UN Security Council, inside the room, we'd be arguing with Russia ferociously about, I don't know, something about weapons inspections or something. And outside the room, I'd take a break, have a cigarette, and talk to my Russian counterpart, Vladimir, who's a great guy. We'd often go and have a beer together, and we'd talk about how idiotic the discussion was in the Security Council. Sometimes he'd even show me his instructions from Moscow. So I wouldn't have to bother to listen to his ambassador to take my notes, because my job was to note down what the Russians said or the Americans said or the French said. To save me the trouble, he said, my ambassador's going to say X, Y, and Z. So I just put that in my notebook, and he made my life easier. So, it was pretty extraordinary, though sometimes it does get very nasty. I've had colleagues of mine break down in tears at the end of a negotiation because it was so rough. So it's not always nice. We were exceptionally careful about what we said to the Iraqis, partly because I knew the Americans were monitoring, or we were, I don't know which, were monitoring the communications from the Iraqi mission to the UN back to Baghdad. So they would record the conversation with me and send that back to Baghdad as, this is what the Brits are saying. So I was very, very careful about what I said, because I didn't want the Americans to think I was going off script. Because if they saw that, they would immediately complain ferociously to my government. And I obviously didn't want that to happen. You do have to be scrupulously careful about what it is you're actually saying. And it's actually, in diplomacy, it's actually pretty unprofessional to say, well, this is what I'm required to say by my government, but this is what I can't really think. Because in truth, what you can't really think doesn't matter. They're not interested in your views unless they're trying to recruit you as a spy themselves and sense that you're deeply disaffected and therefore recruitable, which is sometimes the case. When I was talking to Iraqis, one thing on my private agenda was looking out for them to see if they were disillusioned and could be recruited as British spies. And indeed, I think the deputy head of mission at the Iraqi mission to the UN was recruited. He defected to the US. The FBI organized his defection. So he was disaffected from the Saddam government. So you are looking out for those signs when you're talking to somebody. There's a great saying in diplomacy is nobody is ever entirely your friend and nobody is ever entirely your enemy. And even when you're working with your closest ally, and in that case, the US we very much worked in cahoots with the US. I would call every morning. I would start my day by reading the telegrams from around the world. And then I would call my American counterpart and coordinate how we were going to handle the day at the UN Security Council. And he was a friend of mine. We would go out together a lot. So it was a very, very close relationship. But it was not it wasn't always an easy relationship. In fact, the rudest any diplomat has ever been to me was an American diplomat outside the Security Council, when one senior American diplomat said, "What the f*** are you f***ing saying, Carne? How dare you f***ing say that? I'm going to get your prime minister." Well, I was daring to deviate from the party line on Iraq because our policy was very, very problematic for all sorts of complicated reasons, which are not often talked about today. But we tried to move the US to a more flexible position on Iraq. We failed by and large, and that caused a lot of tension in the relationship. And the British Embassy in Washington, which, it was the kind of poodle in chief in the relationship with the US, because they would often see themselves just as relaying instructions from the Americans to us. That was the kind of relationship we had with the US. If I said something off script in New York, which sometimes I did, trying to move our policy along, trying to negotiate, because negotiation is often about making your own policy change, not just the other guys, the embassy would immediately ring me up and say, what the hell are you up to, Carne? You know, State Department's furious about what you've been saying and all this kind of stuff. And I was quite proud of that because it showed that I was actually independent of mind, though, of course, I wasn't. I was only operating within a very narrow framework of what British American policy actually was. From 1997 onwards, I was Britain's Iraq expert at the UN Security Council, which meant that I was responsible for the UN resolutions on sanctions and weapons inspections on Iraq, which was essentially that Iraq should disarm itself of its so-called weapons of mass destruction, its chemical, biological weapons, and its missiles, and nuclear weapons. It didn't have nuclear weapons, never did, by the way. And that was my responsibility. That was very much a policy of containment for many years, where we claimed that we didn't know whether Iraq had substantial stocks of weapons of mass destruction, but we did know that there were many unanswered questions about Iraq's stocks of weapons. What had happened to these chemical bombs? What had happened to those missiles? And there was a long running to and fro with Iraq about whether they would accept inspections by the UN weapons inspectors to verify, to answer these questions. All of that changed with 9/11, which, you know, I was in New York that day, very shocking, dramatic event. And the US suddenly went on a war footing. People in Washington, the neocons, had convinced the administration that Iraq was a danger, a threat to the region, a threat to the US, and Saddam needed to be got rid of. And Bush convinced Blair of that, and Blair went along with it. And the casus belli, the excuse for war for the Brits, less so for the Americans, was that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and had refused to cooperate with the weapons inspections. And this required the UK to change its story. We had been saying for many years that we had unanswered questions about the weapons stocks. We thought there might be a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But suddenly the story changed to, we think that Iraq has significant stocks of weapons of mass destruction which pose a threat to the UK. You know, the 45-minute claim that Iraq was 45 minutes from launching a weapon of mass destruction at the UK, which was ridiculous because it never had that capability. It wasn't even close to that capability. But I and others worked on these claims in the form of, one was the famous Number 10 dossier, another was there was a Labour Party statement, different documents that were made public, which made these exaggerated claims about weapons of mass destruction. And those of us who worked on it were very concerned about it. We didn't know what was happening. When I would get these drafts of these claims from London, sitting at my desk in New York, I'd be like, what the hell is this? You know, we're saying stuff we've never said before. What's the justification for this? Where is the intelligence justifying this? And that was an important aspect because as the expert on Iraq, I was given a big, often a folder full of intelligence every day on what we knew about WMD. And I worked closely with the weapons inspections experts, people like David Kelly, who was Britain's expert on biological weapons, who did inspections in Iraq. And he and I gave presentations to UN Security Council members, to other experts on this subject, where essentially we have been claiming that we don't have concrete evidence of actual stocks, but we do have very serious questions about what has happened to those stocks. Anyway, I left the mission in 2002 on sabbatical, and so I wasn't there in the months leading up to the war when the claims became even more exaggerated, leading me to think, well, what on earth is going on? Why are they making these claims? And I discussed this with David and others, and I talked to the weapons inspectors about what they were finding. And of course, they were finding absolutely nothing in Iraq. So that was, you know, a big, big shock to me, what was going on, what my government was up to. I mean, nobody knew for sure that they didn't have weapons because we didn't have, you know, CCTV cameras in every Iraqi base, air base, missile storage facility. And things like biological weapons, you only need a tiny laboratory to produce it. So how could we monitor everything? And this was one of the concerns of the people who opposed sanctions, which had been placed on Iraq after the 1991 Gulf War, and which had done a lot of damage to the Iraqi economy and civilian population. And they said, you can't prove a negative. How can you prove that Iraq doesn't have biological weapons when that requires oversight of every chemistry lab in Iraq? Which was a fair point, to be honest. And we wanted sanctions on Iraq because we wanted to so-called contain Iraq. We knew that Iraq, with enormous oil reserves, could rearm very quickly. Before the 1991 war, it had the third largest army in the world, which is a piece of propaganda I worked on during that war. So Iraq could reconstitute itself as a major military threat, which would in turn require substantial allied forces to contain them. And it was easier to contain them through sanctions, which controlled their oil revenue. So we, the UN, had control over Iraq's oil and what they spent it on. So it was an effective containment mechanism. But that view changed after 9/11, when the so-called neocons in Washington said, overthrow Saddam and we'll create democracy not only in Iraq, but the rest of the Middle East. There'll be a new kind of domino theory that democracy in Iraq will produce democracy elsewhere. I mean, ludicrously naive. And we can all see how it turned out, but that's what they convinced the Bush administration to do. And they, in turn, got Blair, at a famous meeting at Bush's ranch in Texas. Blair agreed to go along with it. The Brits needed a legal justification to go to war. Blair needed legal justification in order to persuade his own party to support the war. The only way they could get legal justification was twofold. Number one, claiming Iraq was a threat. Number two, having inspections blocked by Iraq in such a way that this gave legal authority that had been granted in 1991 to apply again in 2003. It's a complicated story, but basically the Brits needed to show that Iraq was not cooperating with the weapons inspections, and in turn they needed to show that Iraq had a significant WMD threat. So that required them to exaggerate the intelligence on WMD. It also required them to get inspectors back in and for them to be blocked by the Iraqis. That part of the equation went badly wrong because the Iraqis didn't block them. They cooperated with them. I mean, they had blocked them many times in the past. Iraq was no angel about this. I'm not trying to paint the Saddam regime as anything other than what it is, which is a brutal tyranny. But they didn't give Britain the legal justification that it was looking for. And the Brits then sought a UN Security Council authorization for the invasion. This was the sort of thing I'd worked on for many years. And they didn't get it. They didn't get the votes. So they didn't have legal authority to go to war. And this is why the other person in the Foreign Office resigned. She was the deputy legal advisor of the Foreign Office. And she said, without authorization from the UN Security Council, this is an illegal war of aggression. That's what it was in legal terms.
Hi, and welcome to Deep.
We love making videos, meeting people, and letting them tell their stories.
We really hope you're enjoying the channel, and if you are and would like a bit more,
We've just launched the series as a podcast on Spotify.
It's the full interviews uncut, so you can hear the whole thing, wherever you are, at home or on the go.
But no matter where you're watching the content, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, as it really helps the channel.
And don't forget to drop a comment below and tell us who you'd like us to talk to next.
Thank you. Now, back to our story.
Okay, cool.
He's never been entirely honest about this war. He claims he is. But what went on inside government has never been fully revealed. He says that the Americans were going to do it anyway, and, they looked to us for support. So we had to do it. And implicitly, he's acknowledging that it wasn't about the threat from WMD. And he felt, I think, and I don't know him, I've never met him, that after 9/11, the Americans were dividing the world into people who were with us or against us. That's what they said. And, as a close ally of the US, we needed to be with them. And, one of the things you realize about being a British diplomat when you're a British diplomat is how completely dependent the UK is on the US for its national security. It's a very, very deep, intimate relationship with the Americans, from nuclear weapons to sharing intelligence to diplomatic cooperation. I mean, it goes up and down, but at that time it was a very, very intimate relationship.
A special relationship, so to say.
Yeah, and it is a special relationship. I mean, the Americans sensibly never called it that, and I don't think we should call it that, but the extent of sharing of intelligence is unique. And maybe they have that relationship with Israel, I don't know, but with the Brits, the sharing of intelligence is extraordinary, of top secret stuff, huge amounts of it, sharing intelligence facilities. And of course, essentially, Britain rents its nuclear weapons from the Americans. I mean, the Americans basically produce the missiles. We produce the warheads, but they produce the missiles, the design of the submarines, all this kind of stuff. Britain pretends it's an independent deterrent. But you can tell that it's not independent because when we test the missiles, even from British submarines, there's an American launch officer on board who orders the launch. So it's essentially a subordinate rental arrangement for our nuclear weapons. That's why Blair, I think, supported it, but that required a lie. And that's how he got Britain into lying about the WMD and forced the rest of his administration basically to produce a lie. And this was basically produced in propaganda terms, in different statements from the government. Which, if the press had been paying attention, which they didn't, they would have seen were dramatically different claims from what we had been claiming for many years before. I mean, we didn't let Iraq off the hook before, but we did say there are unanswered questions about the WMD. We didn't say, in fact, we said this very often, we don't think Iraq is a threat. We would say this to the Americans in our bilateral private talks with them. We would say, policy is working, containment is working, Iraq is not a threat. I thought maybe there's something I didn't know. Maybe there's a piece of intelligence that's the smoking gun that I wasn't aware of. And I was on sabbatical during the time, so I wasn't seeing the regular intelligence feed. So I thought maybe I just didn't know what was going on. But it turned out I did. And over time, I gradually realized that the government, I talked to my colleagues, I talked to people like David Kelly, the BW inspector, and who confirmed that there was no new intelligence pointing to substantial stocks of WMD. So I began to realize that a lie had been perpetrated before the war. This all kind of crystallized in my head when David was hounded to his death by the government for saying that the so-called dossier had been, quote, sexed up, unquote, i.e. the WMD claims had been exaggerated. And that was the point when I suddenly thought something very, very wrong has happened here. It all became clear to me. And eventually I was asked to testify to the first official inquiry into the use of intelligence before the war. Those of us who worked on Iraq were asked to testify to that inquiry. I knew that my testimony would be profoundly critical of what the government had done, so I negotiated for that testimony to be submitted in secret, which the inquiry agreed to, and I'm listed as an anonymous witness, one of two anonymous witnesses to that inquiry. And then I wrote down everything I thought, that they'd lied, that they'd ignored alternatives to war, that they'd broken the law, in a fairly, 7-page note, which was, the turning point of my life, that note. Anyway, I sent that in, and that was the moment where, me and the government basically went in two separate directions. The BBC broadcast a report on the radio saying that an official source, a senior official source, had told them that the government dossier on WMD had been, quote, sexed up, unquote. And the government was furious and said, this is not true. We absolutely deny it. And who is the source? And that became the big question. Who is the source? And David, because he's a very honest man, went to his boss and said, in the Ministry of Defense and said, I have spoken to this journalist, but I can't believe he's saying this, because I'm not a senior official source. I was just giving him a background briefing about what we knew. And the moment his name came out, he was vilified by the British government. They called him names, they insulted him, they belittled him, they humiliated him in public. One of the government's press officers called him a Walter Mitty type figure, a kind of fantasist, which was appalling because he was a very serious, modest, careful, scientific man, an expert, one of the few on that subject. And they humiliated him in public. And there was a huge media storm about it, and he was kicked around, he was interrogated in Parliament. And fairly soon after that began, he was found dead in an Oxfordshire wood with his wrist slashed. Some people still believe that he was murdered by the government, but certainly he was dead. And he'd been, in my view, humiliated to his death by the government, which is almost as bad, perhaps as bad as murdering him. So that was a very, very shocking episode for many people, but I was certainly very shocked. Somehow lying about a war was one thing, but killing our own was another. He was one of us. He was a loyal, very loyal member of the British government. He was one of the very small group of us who worked on Iraq. So, I was very, very shocked by that. I don't think I personally felt a threat of death, but I do remember when I first drafted a resignation letter to my government, which was when I was living back in New York. I do remember feeling, if you send this, you're going to be destroyed in some way. Because living in America at that time, you felt this appalling momentum towards war, like a steam train barreling towards war, and that if you stood up and put your hand up in front of it, you were going to get crushed by it. And somehow intuitively I knew that. And so I didn't have the guts to send my resignation in at that point. I didn't resign until I testified to the inquiry. I wish I'd done otherwise. I wish I'd resigned before the war took place, because I could have said, this is, the government's not telling the truth. They're exaggerating. But I knew if I'd done it then, they would have done much worse to me than they did to David. And the other kind of private thing is that I knew that David's death would in some way inoculate me against what the government would do to me if I came out and resigned, because it was such a scandal for the government when he died that they would not want to repeat it in my case. So they would be much more careful. One of the strange things that happened was when I did resign, I sent my evidence in as my letter of resignation to the Foreign Secretary. He didn't reply, but within a couple of weeks, the Foreign Office sent me a letter from my personnel officer, and I went to see him, and he offered me psychiatric counseling, presumably to prevent me committing suicide and embarrassing the government again, like David had. They also sent me a letter threatening me with prosecution under the Official Secrets Act if I talked publicly about my work. I had to get a lot of legal advice to protect me from prosecution from under the Official Secrets Act. And the government is unforgiving about this kind of thing. The culture of secrecy and not allowing people to speak about their work is very, very strong in government. And they have a deep incentive in maintaining that culture because they don't want some whistleblower to come out today and talk about, what nefarious activities the British government is under, or, the weapons supplies we're giving to Israel, or the secret surveillance flights the RAF is conducting over the Gaza Strip. They want to deter people from blowing the whistle about that. So coming after somebody like me remains a possibility. The basic claim of government is it knows best how to protect our security. And secrecy is a crucial part of that. And if they let the veil down and we see what they really know, like what they knew before the Iraq War, I I think we would be pretty shocked at how incompetent much of government is and how little it knows. There is a deep-seated belief in society that authority knows best. The authorities have this in hand, whatever problem it is, and I have come to distrust that sentiment. Even after the Iraq war and even after my resignation, my father voted again for the Labour Party, for Blair at the next election. And I said to him, why did you do that? I was very angry because to me it was a betrayal, a personal betrayal. I said, why did you do this? And he said, oh, they must have known, i.e. they must have known about Iraq's WMD, and his own son didn't, who'd worked on it. That's how deep-seated it is, that ultimately we think they're right, that we put our faith in them. And in fact, we've got to, if this basic contract where we give up our liberty, we agree to obey the law in return for security. That's the basic contract of government. And part of that contract, in order to preserve that contract, the government needs to pretend it knows best. Well, I have been at the heart of the security state. I've been involved in several wars. I served in Afghanistan. I worked on, 2 Iraq wars, if not more, if you count others. And I'm here to tell you that government doesn't know best, and it's often making it up as it goes along.
And are you talking about the British government there, or all governments?
Since leaving the Foreign Office, I've advised many democratic governments around the world, many democratic political movements, and, they're just struggling human beings like the rest of us, struggling to make sense of the world. They don't have the arrogant claim that the Brits do, that somehow they're better than other people, somehow, we offer a model to the rest of the world. So if you're a guerrilla movement fighting for self-determination for your country, you don't pretend that you know best. You know you're up against the power. And that gives you a humility about what you know and your abilities. And that humility is actually a very powerful thing. It's very foolish to think you know best, because that arrogance weakens you. It actually closes you to new knowledge and to the flexibility that actually understanding the world today requires. And, I talk to, this sounds rather cruel, but I talk to former friends of mine who joined the Foreign Office at the same time as me in 1989. And they're now ambassadors, got their knighthood, some of them being ambassadors in 5 different places. And I meet them and I think, you're so much less than you used to be. Your brain has become frozen. You don't think as flexibly as you used to. I remember you when you were a young man, and you were great. You were cosmopolitan, thoughtful, had real flair. And now you've just become, he's still a nice guy, but you could just tell by the way they thought that they'd just become more rigid, that the state had circumscribed the space in which they allowed themselves to think. And that's terrible. I'm so glad that didn't happen to me. Because it was happening to me before I left. I was beginning to think like the state. I was doing very well in the diplomatic service. It was, I was very well thought of. I was on a pathway to senior positions, ambassadorships and all the rest of it. But that would have required me to kill that independent part of me that thought for itself, that thought for myself. And that part was diminishing year by year as I stayed in it. And I'm so glad I left. Democracy is not truly representative as it claims to be, that it's run by a very small number of people taking decisions for the mass. That is not only in itself problematic, but that small group is eminently corruptible because access to them is limited, and those with the most resources, the most money, get access and thus influence over policy. And you see that today. If you are a donor to the Labour Party or to the Conservative Party, you get access to ministers. This is openly advertised as legal. And it's, of course, much worse in the US, where political corruption is open, legal, massive. And I also came to the conclusion that one of the deep crises we have is a crisis of agency, that people feel they have no control over the things that really matter to them. The only way to give them control was actually for them to be in charge of their own affairs, to make decisions for themselves, self-government. not violent chaos and anarchy of everybody doing whatever they want, but collective decision-making on an equal basis, and that collective decision-making would reweave the fabric of a very tattered and angry society. That philosophy is called anarchism. It's bottom-up self-government. And at the same time, I became, and always had been, very skeptical of capitalism, that its central claim that we are driven by the desire for more consumption. That's the central claim of neoclassical economics, which underlies capitalism, that is the point of our lives, to maximize what they call utility, which is an invented term to justify the theory, through consumption of goods and services. And that's what humans are about. And I don't think anybody actually believes that that's what humans are really about. We need things to survive, to be comfortable, of course. But actually the most important things are not that. They are things without names. They are what happens between human beings. They are our relationships. They are things like meaning, purpose, belief, love. And how do you construct a society that puts love at its center? It doesn't look anything like the society we've got today. I think we're in deep crisis now. And I've gone on this journey. I've written about it to a degree. I'm still writing about it. I'm still exploring. It's partly even a spiritual journey into meaning, into the meaning of the self, into that unnameable, untermable thing that we're all aware of, that is arguably more important than anything else.